Open a satellite map and find the city of Tyre on the coast of Lebanon. You will see an ordinary peninsula, a thumb of land pushing into the Mediterranean, covered in streets and rooftops. Nothing about it looks strange until you learn one fact. This city was born an island. For most of its history, roughly a kilometer of open water stood between Tyre and the shore, and that water made it the safest city in the eastern Mediterranean for 1,000 years. The neck of land that ties Tyre to the coast today is not geology. It began as a military structure, a stone causeway built by hand across the sea in 7 months in the year 332 before the Common Era, on the orders of a king who was 24 years old. The sea never took it back. Sand settled against it century after century, until the weapon became a landscape and the island stopped being an island, permanently. Which makes the modern map of Lebanon something strange, the last surviving eyewitness of a siege. So this episode asks 3 questions. Why did a king who was busy conquering the largest empire on earth stop for 7 months in front of one city? What did those 7 months cost the people inside it? And who actually told us this story? And how far should we believe them? Start with why he stopped. In November of 333 BCE, at a narrow coastal plain called Issus, Alexander of Macedon broke the field army of Darius, the Persian king of kings. Darius fled east, leaving his camp, his treasury, and his own family behind. The obvious next move was to chase him into the heart of the empire. Alexander did the opposite. He turned south, down the Mediterranean coast, and his reasoning has come down to us. Persia's most dangerous weapon against him was not the army he had just beaten. It was a navy. Hundreds of warships ruling the Eastern Sea, crewed overwhelmingly by Phoenicians. Sailors from the coastal cities of Aratus, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. Alexander had no fleet that could face them, and he knew what that fleet could do behind his back. Cut his lines to Greece, fund revolt in the cities he had left, and turn one war into 2. So he chose to defeat a navy without fighting it. Take the home ports one by one, and the fleet dissolves on its own. Because crews do not keep fighting for an empire while their own cities and their own families stand in someone else's hands. It worked with almost no resistance. Aratus yielded. Byblos yielded. Sidon opened its gates, by most accounts, gladly. One city remained, the oldest, the richest, and the best defended of them all. And Tyre had a very good reason to believe it could refuse him. Tyre was old when Alexander was born, old when Rome was a village. Its sailors had planted trading posts across the whole length of the Mediterranean, and its most famous colony, Carthage, was on its way to becoming an empire in its own right. Its wealth rested on a color, the purple dye pressed drop by tiny drop from a sea snail, so costly to make that purple cloth became the uniform of royalty across the ancient world. Kings dressed in what Tyre sold them, and the city itself was its masterpiece. New Tyre stood on an island offshore, ringed by fortifications that ancient writers describe, on the landward side, as rising some 45 meters above the sea, the height of a 14-story building with the waves at its foot. Inside the ring were 2 enclosed harbors, a northern one facing Sidon and a southern one facing Egypt, and a population that had every reason for confidence, because Tyre had done this before. The Assyrian Empire had come and gone. The Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar had besieged the city for 13 years. 13. and by most accounts, the affair ended not in capture, but in a negotiated arrangement. For 1,000 years, whoever ruled the mainland, Tyre made the same calculation. The sea is our wall, and no army walks on water. In 332 BCE, that calculation met a man who refused the premise. What Alexander asked for when his army reached the shore opposite Tyre sounded almost modest. He wished to enter the city and offer a sacrifice in its great temple, the shrine of Melkart, the figure Tyre worshipped as lord of the city, and the one Greeks identified with their own Heracles, the hero Alexander's royal house claimed as an ancestor. Read one way, it was an act of respect, a young king honoring an ancient sanctuary. Read the way Tyre's council read it, it was something else entirely. In that world, a royal sacrifice in Melkart's temple was a statement of sovereignty. It was what kings of Tyre did. Let this foreigner perform it, and the city had crowned him without a word being spoken. The council's answer was a diplomat's masterpiece. They would gladly honor his wishes, they said, at the older shrine in Old Tyre on the mainland. The new city itself would admit neither Persian nor Macedonian. It was neutrality, dressed in courtesy, and it rested on the same 1,000-year confidence. Refuse politely, hold the water, and wait for this storm to pass like all the others. Both positions deserve to be stated plainly. Alexander could not leave a neutral island fortress sitting on his supply line with a Persian fleet still at sea. Tyre had survived a dozen empires precisely by bowing to none of them. Neither side was being irrational. What happened to the men Alexander sent next closed the space between those positions for good. Alexander sent envoys into Tyre to press the request one final time. The men did not come back. The ancient accounts state that they were thrown from the walls into the sea. To modern ears, that is a brutal end to a negotiation. To ancient ears, it was something more specific. The person of an envoy was held inviolable by every code the Mediterranean world recognized. And what Tyre had done was not just refusal. It was a declaration that no further conversation would ever happen. The accounts do not tell us what the council intended by it, whether cold policy or a crowd's fury, and we will not guess. What we do know is Alexander's response, because it is one of the strangest decisions in the history of warfare. He had no fleet. The city floated a kilometer away behind the tallest walls on the sea. Any conventional commander reads that board and moves on. The coast was already his. Tyre could be masked and starved at leisure. Instead, Alexander gathered his engineers and announced that the army would walk to the island. If the sea was Tyre's wall, he would remove the sea. The city on the water was about to watch a road grow toward it, one stone at a time. The building material was already lying on the shore. Old Tyre, the ancient mainland district the islanders had left behind, was dismantled house by house, wall by wall, and carried into the water. Cedar trunks from the Lebanese slopes were driven into the seabed as piles, and the rubble of the old city was packed between them. The structure the engineers were raising is called a mole, a causeway of stone, reported by the ancient writers as some 60 meters wide, aimed straight at the island. In the shallows, it grew fast. The seabed near the shore was sandbank and mud, the water waist-deep, and thousands of soldiers worked in shifts while the city watched from its ramparts. At first, the accounts say, the Tyrians treated it as theater, rowing out to jeer at men hauling stones into the sea, shouting that no man gives orders to the water. The laughter did not last. As the mole crawled into deeper water, everything slowed. Each meter now swallowed whole houses' worth of stone. The work crept into range of the walls, and Tyre's artillery and archers began sweeping the causeway's head, while warships slid out of the two harbors to rake it from both sides at once. Alexander answered by building 2 siege towers at the tip of the mole, sheathed in rawhide, tall enough to shoot back at the battlements and shelter the men working below. The city studied that arrangement carefully and prepared an answer made of fire. The Tyrians took one of their largest transport ships and rebuilt it as a weapon. They packed the hull with dried brush, pitch, and sulfur, slung cauldrons of oil from the yardarms, and loaded ballast into the stern so that the bow rode high out of the water, high enough to slide up onto the mole instead of stopping against it. Then they waited for a following wind, towed the ship at speed toward the causeway, set it alight, and let it go. The fire ship mounted the mole's head exactly as designed. The 2 siege towers, months in the building, burned with everything in them, and Tyrian crews swarmed out of the harbors to tear down whatever the fire had missed. Not long after, a storm drove waves along the causeway and clawed away a stretch of the work. The accounts differ on the order of these blows, but not on the result. A season of labor was largely undone. What happened next is why this siege is still taught. Alexander did not abandon the mole. He ordered it rebuilt wider, angled against the prevailing wind, with whole trees layered into the stonework to bind it. But he had also understood the real lesson of the fire. No causeway would ever reach Tyre while Tyre owned the water around it. The bridge could not win alone. The next weapon had to float, and Alexander went to collect it from his enemy. The Persian navy had a design flaw, and Alexander's whole coastal strategy had been aimed at it from the start. Its ships were crewed by the very cities he now held. When the sailors of Aratus, Byblos, and Sidon learned that their home ports had changed hands, their squadrons peeled away from the Persian fleet and sailed home, which now meant sailing to Alexander. The kings of Cyprus, reading the new map, brought their fleets across as well. Within weeks, the man who had not owned a single warship on this coast stood at Sidon with, by the ancient counts, somewhere over 200. The siege turned inside out. Tyre's own navy, a fraction of that number, withdrew behind the chained mouths of its 2 harbors, and the blockade the city had laughed at from its walls closed over both of them. The island that had always been fed and reinforced by sea was now sealed by sea. One hope remained. Carthage, the daughter city, by then a naval power of the western Mediterranean, had envoys inside Tyre, and help had been spoken of. It never came. Carthage had wars of its own. The accounts record one desperate Tyrian sortie against the Cypriot squadron, brave, briefly successful, and finally crushed against the blockade. The city that owned the sea now watched the sea change flags, and the road resumed its crawl toward the walls. The end came from the water, not from the causeway. Through the 7th month of the siege, Alexander's crews lashed ships together in pairs and hung battering rams between them, floating siege engines that could test the fortifications anywhere along the circuit, while the defenders had to guard all of it at once. South of the Egyptian harbor, a stretch of wall began to give. A first assault on the crack was thrown back. Then, on a calm day in July of 332 BCE, everything moved at once. The fleet pressed both harbors. Missile ships worked the whole ring of walls. The towers on the completed mole engaged the landward face. And at the southern breach, 2 ships carrying boarding bridges came alongside, and the shield-bearing guards, the hypaspists, went up and onto the wall, with Alexander himself, by the ancient accounts, crossing among the first of them. Once the wall was lost, the rest followed with terrible speed. The breach widened, the harbors were forced from both sides, and columns converged through the streets of a city that had held the greatest army of the age at bay for 7 months. By nightfall, the island that no empire had ever taken by force had fallen. Tyre had resisted Alexander longer than the entire Persian field army had. Then came the accounting, and it is exactly where our sources stop agreeing. The numbers from the fall of Tyre survive only in books written long after, and they do not match. So here they are, with their authors' names attached. Arrian, the most sober of them, writes that about 8,000 Tyrians fell in the final assault, against roughly 400 of Alexander's men across the whole siege, and that some 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. Curtius Rufus tells it darker. He gives 6,000 fallen within the walls, and adds a detail Diodorus echoes. About 2,000 of the men taken in arms were not simply enslaved. Their ends were staged along the shoreline, in view of the sea lanes, as a message to any city weighing a refusal. Arrian says nothing of this. His silence may mean it never happened, or that his sources, officers of the army, preferred not to record it. We cannot know, and we will not choose for you. The accounts also agree on mercies. Those who took refuge in the temple of Melkart were spared, Tyre's king Azamilcus among them, with the envoys from Carthage. And one account holds that crews from Sidon, serving in the attacking fleet, quietly carried thousands of Tyrians to safety in their own ships. If true, sailors of one Phoenician city rescuing the people of another from the fleet they both now served. When it was over, Alexander walked into the temple he had asked to enter 7 months earlier, and made his sacrifice to what Tyre had worshipped as Melkart. He got the ceremony. The city got the causeway, and we got the story, from men writing centuries too late to have seen any of it. No eyewitness account of the siege of Tyre survives. Callisthenes, the historian who marched with the army, is lost. The memoirs of Alexander's own officers, Ptolemy, who went on to rule Egypt, and Aristobulus, are lost. Every word we have comes from writers working 3 to 4.5 centuries later. Diodorus, Curtius, and latest of all, Arrian, each assembling a picture from books that no longer exist and choosing what to keep. The choices show. Arrian trusted the officers, which buys him restraint and costs him their blind spots. No officer's memoir dwells on what victory did to the defeated. Curtius reached for drama and moral color, and is regularly accused of preferring the better story to the better source. Diodorus compressed whole campaigns into summaries. The 2,000 on the shoreline are the perfect case study, present in the dramatic tradition, absent in the official one, and unrecoverable now. This is not a reason to throw the story away. It is a reason to hold it the way a court holds testimony. The outline confirmed by every witness, the details weighed by who is speaking and why. Everything this episode has told you is that outline. The siege, the mole, the fleet, the fall, agreed on by writers who agree on little else. And there remains one witness none of them can contradict, because it is still physically there. Strategically, the 7 months at Tyre purchased exactly what Alexander had predicted on the day he turned south. The Persian navy, the one force that could have carried the war back into Greece behind him, simply ceased to exist as a threat, without a single great sea battle. Its crew's home cities were all now his. The eastern Mediterranean had changed owners at the price of one siege. The coast road south stayed open. Gaza, trusting its height and its walls, refused him and held for 2 months. It fell to the same patient engineering. And then Egypt, which had watched all of it, yielded without a fight. The country received him as a liberator from Persian rule, and on its coast he marked out the street grid of a city to carry his name. Alexandria would grow into the greatest port of the ancient Mediterranean, home to the lighthouse and the library, a story this channel has told in an episode of its own. None of that happens with Tyre defiant and a Persian fleet alive behind him. The 7 months that looked like an obsession over one insult were, on the map, the hinge of the entire war. The moment the sea stopped being Persian. That is what the siege bought the king. What it left behind belongs to the city and to the coastline itself. Tyre did not end in 332 BCE. The city was resettled, colonists brought in, survivors returning, the harbors reopening, because a port that valuable does not stay empty. Barely 17 years later, it was strong enough to matter again, and found itself besieged again, this time holding out for over a year against one of Alexander's own successors. It went on to a long life as a great Roman city, and its purple workshops stained the robes of emperors for centuries more. But the strangest afterlife belongs to the causeway. The mole sat across the currents that moved sand along this coast, and the sea, which Alexander had fought for 7 months, quietly finished his project for him. Sand settled against the stone road on both sides, season after season, widening it year by year, until the causeway disappeared inside a natural-looking neck of land. The formation geographers call a tombolo. The island fused with the mainland permanently. Modern Tyre lives on top of that neck. Streets, houses, markets. People cross the old siege line every day without seeing it, because there is nothing left to see. The weapon became the ground. The city outlived the siege by 23 centuries and counting, and it did so physically standing on the instrument that ended its independence. Which brings this story back to where it started, to the map. Weigh what this episode has been made from. A political refusal that 2 reasonable sides could not walk back. 7 months of engineering against geography. A navy defeated in harbor without a battle. And a written record that is late, partial, and contradictory. Hostile witnesses who agree on the outline and dispute the cost, with the darkest claim of all suspended between one author's drama and another's silence. But the siege of Tyre left one document that no historian wrote and no copyist could corrupt. It changed the shape of the earth. The satellite image from the start of this episode, the ordinary-looking peninsula on the coast of Lebanon, is the primary source, an account of the siege written in stone and sand, during the siege, by the siege, and still being published every time a map of the eastern Mediterranean is printed. Almost nothing else on a modern map remembers a single military decision from 23 centuries ago. Borders have moved, empires have dissolved, the very coastline has shifted, but the neck of land at Tyre is still exactly where a 24-year-old ordered the sea to become a road. So perhaps the question this episode leaves is not whether the old writers told the story straight. It is how many other wars are hiding in plain sight, printed on maps we never think to question.